Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Selkiecast. Before we get into today's topic, I just want to take a second and give a shout out to fellow podcaster Vanessa Rogers for having me on her podcast, The Fabric of Folklore, a few months ago. We talked all about this podcast, and she picked my brain about selkies, and it was a great conversation. Not to mention that her podcast is a great companion to this one because as opposed to how I'm being very hyper-focused about this one branch of folklore, her whole intention is to study folklore in general, give a much broader scope, and look at it from a big picture point of view. She's had a lot of amazing and much more qualified and knowledgeable guests than me on her show. It's a great podcast. I'd really recommend checking it out. So my episode is episode 10 of Fabric of Folklore podcast. So if this is your first time joining us, thank you very much. It's great to have you here on this journey. And what this journey is kind of a culmination of a couple decades now of my fascination, obsession really, with the Celtic folklore of selkies, who are fairy creatures that can transform back and forth between seals and people. And if you'd like some more context and understanding about why I'm doing this, I'd really recommend going back and listening to episode 1, because that's what that one's all about. But in short, at this point at least, I'm just cataloging my research, my findings, all the stories and books and films and so on that I've come across and collected over the years. And by doing so, I'm hoping to gain a deeper understanding and a clearer view of where this lore came from, how and why it's evolved over time and cultures, and hopefully give some insight into where not just this folklore, but humans need to tell stories and create lore is headed. So the reason this episode is called Part 2 about short stories and anthologies is just because the last episode, even though I didn't title it Part 1, was focused on 2 books that were collections of short stories. So it seemed like the next logical step was to continue cataloging the rest of the short stories that I have in my collection before I go on to more longer form stuff. But unlike episode 2, which was about selkie specific books, the vast majority of what I'm about to go over are from more general fairy tale and lore and myths and legends anthology collections, but there'll be a few fun outliers here and there too. As I've said before, but I feel the need to keep repeating, what I'm presenting so far on this podcast is, for the most part, stuff that I've come across more organically, just things that I've happened to run into in the right place in the right time. Like for instance, when I visited Ireland in 2008, and I was just browsing around bookstores when we'd be in a fun little town, and if I saw something that was even remotely related, I just felt compelled to add it to my collection. I didn't have any big intentions for my growing collection of selkie stories and books and such back then, but it was just one of those things. And then I get recommendations and gifts from people that knew I was into this stuff, or sometimes seemingly happenstantially, but who knows, maybe serendipitously, I would be somewhere that's not a bookstore or a Renaissance fair and somehow still have selkie material seemingly kind of appear out of an unexpected nowhere, which is probably that phenomena where once we're aware of something, we see and hear about it all the time, something really common, and we're like, how did I never know this? And it's probably just that we just didn't pay attention. So obviously my radars and scanners are always on and aware, even if I'm not conscious about it, so it makes sense that I notice these things when they pop up. But all that is to say that I am well aware that I could just Google search, and I have, for all the world's selkie related material, and just go item by item and create a checklist, but that's just not my way. That seems too rote and corporate and easy. So, however, if you do have any recommendations for me that I haven't covered, I would love to have them in my collection, and it would be so much more meaningful to me to have it recommended than to just have it marketed to me online. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. Just like the last episode, I am going to go through one story at a time, summarize it. I didn't think to mention this last time, I guess because this stuff doesn't really strike me as fitting into our more like modern internet age of, hey, spoiler alert kind of mentality, because these are ancient oral traditional stories that have been told for generations. But I do understand that some people don't like to have the ending of stories spoiled for them before they experience them themselves. I respect that. So in subsequent episodes, I will make it a point to uphold that idea, especially when we get into the more long-form narrative-based kind of media that I've discovered with this content over the years, especially novels and films, because they are meant to be more of an experience than just a recounting of information. But right now we're still in the realm of generally looking at this from less as narrative fiction based on material that inspired those stories. And instead, we're still in the realm where these authors and editors are more recounting the traditional oral stories that were passed down to them or their families or their culture. And as you will find, a lot of them are very similar, which is kind of the point of me doing this, to compare and contrast and gain insight about the lore as a whole through that process. So I do hope that summarizing these stories doesn't spoil anything for anyone. But if it does, just like in all of my episodes, anytime I mention anything that I have access to, I'm going to link it in the show notes, which you can find at breathingunderwater.us. And I highly encourage anybody interested to, at the very least, look up these books yourself and enjoy the ride just like I have. So I'm going to go through these in publication date order, which is not necessarily when the stories were written or collected. Again, a lot of them have been passed down orally for generations and nobody knows exactly where they first came from or how they were first originally told. But I just thought that publication date of the collection, not necessarily of the story, was one way to at least add a little rhyme and reason for giving it some kind of starting point and ending point. So first up, we are starting all the way back in 1888 when T. Crofton Croker, whose name has popped up a lot in my research for being a very famous author and collector of oral traditions. And these two stories are from a collection of fairy tales called The Book of Fairy and Folktales of Ireland. Interestingly, neither of these stories are selkie specific, but they have enough crossover that I felt it prudent to include them. And the first of the two from this collection is called Flory Cantillion's Funeral. And another thing you'll hear me say a lot is I apologize for my most likely butchering of names and place and dialect pronunciations. Even though I am Scotch-Irish in my ancestry, I was born and raised in the mid-Atlantic United States mainland, and I just have no conception about how to give these words justice. So please forgive me. But remember, this is more informational than it is about articulation accuracy, for what it's worth. So in Flory Cantillion's Funeral, we are in Ballyhigh Bay, off the Kerry coast. Local man Connor Crowe is compelled to investigate the claims of a submerged chapel off the shore after his relative by marriage, Flory Cantillon, passes away. Due to Flory's family's strong attachment to their ancient burial place at this chapel, the family has a custom of leaving their departed's coffin on the shore's edge, believing the tides to take them to the chapel. Connor stages a stake out on the beach nearby Flory's coffin and eventually sees mysterious figures emerge from the sea, conversing about the fact that 1. They are indentured to perform this task because their king's daughter, Fula, was buried at the now submerged cemetery by her mortal husband, and 2. If anyone should see and hear them performing this task, their responsibility will be relinquished. Well, it is relinquished because Connor did see and hear them performing this task. So even though that one may have nothing to do with selkies specifically, as you'll hear on other episodes of this podcast, I've come across very similar stories in my selkie adjacent research, some of which that have included seals, where people leave coffins by the seashore thinking that some kind of supernatural or fairy being is transporting them to their rightful place of burial under the sea. And since Connor does see people emerging from the ocean, who's to say that they're not selkies? The next story is called The Soul Cages, and there are no selkies to be found here, even though they do mention seals by the shore where our main character lives. But instead, this is about Murrows. And you will definitely hear me talk more about Murrows, both in this episode and moving forward. And even though they don't have anything specifically to do with the seal folk, there's definitely lore crossover about the ability to transform and being a seafaring fairy creature. But several times I've also found, both in these oral traditions and in fiction, where Murrows and selkies cross paths. So there's definitely a precedent there for them to kind of coexist and cohabitate. And this story begins with a informational introduction about Murrows, where they describe Murrow males having green teeth, green hair, pig's eyes, and red noses, while women are beautiful with fishtails and little duck-like scales between their fingers, who sometimes mate with good-looking fishermen. They can come ashore in the shape of little hornless cows, but when they're in their own shape, they have a red cap called, and I apologize for my pronunciation, Cahulin druith, usually covered with feathers, and if it's stolen, it impairs them from returning to the ocean. So with that in mind, let us go to Dunbeg Bay in County Clare, where Jack Doherty, a fisherman, sights a male Murrow one day and befriends him, wherein the Murrow provides Jack an extra red hat so that Jack may join him for a meal under the ocean. They dive down together where Jack finds open air at the bottom, and I quote, "The sea like a sky, the fishes like birds swimming about in it." In the Murrow's meager home, Jack meets the Murrow's family, who prepare a meal for them, and afterwards the Murrow casually shows Jack his collection of drowned sailors' souls trapped in pots. And though Jack assumes this isn't malicious, but just a misunderstanding about what souls need, because the Murrow thinks that he's keeping them safe, Jack still inwardly vows to free them because he knows that that's what souls really need. So he contrives a whole plan to invite the Murrow to his house for dinner, eventually gets him pass out drunk with his wife's best liquor, whom he sent on a bit of a pilgrimage to get her out of the house for a while. And once the Murrow is down and out, Jack steals his hat and he dives down back to his house to free the souls. But while he's away, his wife comes home, only to find the Murrow passed out in her house. Luckily, though, Jack arrives soon after, explains everything to her, and being a good Christian woman, she agrees with his intentions, though not maybe his tactics. And the Murrow, never discovering that the souls were freed, remains best friends with Jack for years to come until one day he just stops coming to the surface and Jack never knows why. Published in 1983 and edited by, I kid you not, Michael Scott. Here's a couple tales from the Irish folk and fairy tale Omnibus. First up, The Sea Maid. And again, this is not specifically about selkies. Interestingly that we haven't actually recounted a selkie tale yet in my selkie podcast, but we'll get there, I promise. This one does mention seals though, and it follows a similar trajectory as a lot of these stories do. And this one does not mention the specific location, which I always try to include in here because I think it gives a little bit of insight as we look more broadly and cross-reference these things and see how things are both different and similar depending on exactly where they're from and who's telling them. So a fisherman who is collecting firewood on the strand thinks he sees a seal in the water, but it's actually a black-haired woman with webbed fingers. She emerges wearing a green cloak, which he steals. She reluctantly marries him and has 3 kids until her son finds her cloak hidden in the thatches of the roof, and she returns to the sea with 2 of her kids. The fisherman father catches the son before she's able to take him too. So this one I thought was interesting because it, tells your pretty typical selkie story without actually being about a selkie. But another difference is the tone is generally a little darker and more vengeful than typical selkie stories because the sea maid is more malicious, because they mention that the sea maid maliciously grins at him before returning to the sea with her daughters. And it implies, because this is what the dad assumes happened, that she is drowning the kids to get back at him for holding her essentially prisoner for so long. So if that is what happened, at least he was able to save his son. There's also some interesting lore they mentioned here, including that quote-unquote water maids were said to be subjects of Lear, the Lord of the Sea, who hail from Tir Fothuin, which is, I assume, Irish for the land beneath the sea. And their water cloaks are talisman, quote, woven of the essence of the sea and the elements of the air, mixed with the spirit of the land, which allows them to travel between and live comfortably on land or in the sea. Sound familiar? Oh look, an actual selkie story. Here we go. This is called The Seal Woman. In Blacksod Bay, near Dugort and Sleevemore, a young fisherman sees 13 people emerge from the ocean who participate in a mating ritual which is overseen by an elder, who gathers their cloaks that include a whalebone button at the nape. The fisherman manages to steal one, hoping to sell it, but when the rest of the seal folk return to the ocean, the woman who is missing a cloak discovers his theft, and she explains its importance. It's the only way that her folk, which she calls Ron, can live between the land and the sea. So the man demands a barter of sunken Spanish treasure, which she agrees to, but she needs her cloak to retrieve it. He doesn't trust this, so he assaults her instead. Luckily, though, a bull seal comes to her rescue, smacks him down hard, but lets him live. However, the sea gets revenge a year later when his broken body washes up on shore after seemingly having fallen into the ocean while tide pool hunting. Some other various lore aspects that they mention in here is that the roan speech sounds like music to him, and we hear a lot in these stories about Selkies' love for music. So I think it's interesting that in this case their talking is musical, at least to humans, but also the seal woman can apparently make him understand the language when she wants, because it goes from him hearing intelligible singing to words that he understands. In addition, it seems that she can somewhat entrance him, because while she's talking to him, it describes that he's a little bit in a trance and it's hard for him to think clearly. The seal woman describes the history of her people to him as well. Quote, "They were banished to the waves when the last of the people of the goddess fled the fields of man. And ever since then, every century, they leave their seal caves to perform the rite of life mating ritual on land so they can go between both. But if they mate in the sea, they can never leave it," which seems to imply that if a selkie mates in the sea, then they stay a seal. But if they mate on land, like these dozen or so people were, they're able to transformative selkies and can live between both, but they can only do it every 100 years. Always a catch. This next story in a collection called Irish Ghosts and Hauntings is called The Murrow, so we're back to that already. And we're also back to the author being Michael Scott. So this was published in 1994, and the last one was in 1983. And the last one, Michael Scott was an editor, and in this one he's listed as the author, so I don't know if it's the same person or not. But suffice it to say, we didn't always get to see what Steve Carell was doing on his computer in the office, so...
Well, how the turntables...
So this one is unique in that it tells the story from both characters' points of view. So we have a river Murrow and then a sheep shepherd who both unknowingly coexist near a large river called Blackwater, which is near the town of Ewood. And the Blackwater River flows from the mountain into the sea. So our river Murrow heroine is hunted by a local sheep shepherd who first thinks that he sees a seal or an otter in the river and he wants its pelt. But he still wants to club her when he sees her true form, which from his description is pretty mermaidish, as he describes her having a tail, but scaly skin all over, webbed fingers, and gills in her throat. When he swings his club at her, though, she grabs him and pulls him in the river, believing him to be a lover that she had had while she was human. And this is another one that's a little darker than usual when it comes to these kinds of stories, because from his point of view, he's being pulled to his death. From her point of view, he's thrashing around because he's so excited to finally be reunited with his ancient love. Lots of extra details mentioned in here, especially from the Murrow's point of view, because we get a lot of memories and visions, like how Murrows were once humans that abandoned the land, that they were possibly the Tuatha De Danann who left the world of men and, quote, change and altered so that they could live in new environments. In this Murrow's case, though, she recalls being human and having to abandon her original home in a long-forgotten time because of a volcanic eruption. But fleeing on boats, her people find a new island that they call Erin, which was thusly conquered by invaders yielding iron, which they could not withstand. So it seems like a string of bad luck led not to their demise, but to her people's survival instincts creating the opportunity for them to not have to deal with all this land-bound crap anymore. She also mentions being from a group of people called the Danu, where their god of life was unwilling to die because the goddess would die with her. At one point, she muses on being lonely, but not alone, because she's aware of other similar creatures to her that also abandon the world of man for rivers and lakes, and Tir Foi Thuin, which I guess is Irish for the land beneath the waves. And even though she's a Murrow, she does recall run-ins with the Roan, which they call the seal folk in here, when she ventured out of the mouth of the river into the ocean. The next collection is Banshees, Beasts, and Brides from the Sea by Bob Curran. Published in 1996, this specific story is called Brides from the Sea. But before the story, there is an informational intro, which suggests that Celtics often use the term mermaid interchangeably between English mermaids and Irish selkies, selkies with an I this time. They travel the ocean in sealskin cloaks, but the abduction of which compels them to do a human's bidding. It also suggests that mermaids could take other forms like small hornless cattle or fairy cows, which we heard about earlier, didn't we? And seabirds. The intro also mentions that the ancient Irish families, the O'Flahertys, O'Sullivans, and Cantillans of Kerry, the latter which we heard a story about earlier as well, and the McNamaras from Clare, as some of the many who, quote, claim they can trace their descendancy from unions between mermaids and humans. So we are brought to Ballyhaig Bay, Ardfert, where a part of the town containing a church and cemetery was submerged in ancient times. But the townsfolk kept the tradition of leaving their dead's coffins on the ocean's edge to be carried away, they believed, by the sea folk whom their ancestors had a pact to continue burying their dead in their sacred burial grounds. This is confirmed when a skeptic of the town hides out in nearby cliffs to stake out a funeral and prove that the coffins are simply just being washed away by the tide. However, 4 shrouded creatures with 3 clawed hands from the sea awkwardly make their way to the coffin, complaining about the pact that started with a marriage between the daughter of one of their ancient kings and the daughter of a Cantillon forebearer, and their eventual burial in the now submerged cemetery. But they also mention a prophecy to break the pact, which the skeptic inadvertently fulfills by tripping and accidentally revealing himself, which proves to our sea folk that he saw and heard the ceremony, which lets them off the hook. So obviously, this is from the same place and mentions the same family as the story that we started with. But what's interesting about this take of it, and what I think is interesting about studying these stories this way, and what really inspired me to do this podcast, is the differences between them. So for one thing, this was published 100 years later than the first collection that we talked about. And in that first collection by Croker, he didn't describe the mysterious figures at all, other than using terms like mysterious or stranger. In this version, they are much more detailed and much more menacing and non-human than we were ever given a reason to believe before. They're also much more menacing and non-human than selkies we usually see, with their 3 clawed hands, quote, their sepulchral voice. They also refer to the man as a mortal, so that's interesting. In this collection, there are other stories about mermaids, including a siren-like one, and one very similar to the typical Selkie bride kind of story, except in this case, it's the abuse that the fisherman bestows upon her, which allows her to leave from her bondage, not finding her skin. But none of these stories make specific reference to cloaks or skin that are so common in Selkie specific stories. So it seems that they're about traditional mermaids. And again, just like with Murrows, I think there's definitely a lot of crossover. And like it said in the intro to this book, that some cultures use the word mermaid to describe a variety of different fairy creatures from the sea. But if I went down the mermaid rabbit hole, that would be way, way too much for me to tackle here. And also, I just don't have the same affinity for mermaids. As I mentioned in the first episode, they're just so much more commonplace and well-known than selkies in general, to my estimation, that I just don't think there would be as much to glean from that. So that's why I don't recount those stories in more detail here. In the collection Celtic Fairy Tales for Children by Philip Wilson, published in 1999, the story of the Seal Woman consists of a farmer who is not interested in marrying anybody until he spies selkies on the nearby shore and manages to get a skin of one of them as they flee from him. The skin owner sobbingly asks for it back, and the farmer does feel bad, but not bad enough apparently, because his solution is to convince her to stay with him and have a large family. However, one day her youngest daughter reveals that she knows where the farmer has been hiding her skin. She immediately takes it and returns to her sea family, one of the more common Selkie bride iterations. Published in 2000, Irish Tales of the Fairies and the Ghost World by Jeremiah Curtin, we have the story Tom Moore and the Seal Woman. And with the same thrust of the last story, we have our typical fisherman steals skin, though in this case they refer to it as a hood, of a beauty on a sea rock who gives him a family, but finds her hood years later and returns to the sea. In this story, though, there's an extra sequence about villagers killing seals, and the woman weeps over them, only for their buried bodies to disappear when she goes looking for them. Also, to make some more connections, back in episode 2 in the book People of the Sea by David Thompson, this story mentions the Macodrum clan. It mentions that they are said to have webbing between their fingers and toes, but it's lessened over the generations. This next collection, simply titled Irish Ghosts, is by Geddes and Grosset, published in 2002. The story is called The Seal Man. It's on the Connemara coast, where a fisherman kills a seal while out fishing, and then back on shore goes to a house to get a light for his pipe, only to find the seal that he thought he killed in a house, but as a man, who he refers to as a Sheogus, which is a being that can't be killed by a mortal. The seal lets the fisherman go, but in a threatening manner. In the Scottish and Fairy Folktales collection, which was edited by Sir George Douglas and published in 2000, we have 3 stories and a little bit of an informational intro, which tells us about a version, like we've heard before, of this global undersea world with the bottom of the ocean as the sky, and it has various inhabitants, sea treasure decorated abodes, and the ability to put on the skin, though it mentions this as a demonical possession of a sea creature, which can be a fish or a seal, and so on, to either travel wholly as that creature or partially, like a mermaid, to the surface world where they can shed their skin, and it's implied that mermaids can too, but they'll be stuck there if stolen or lost. It also mentions that the term mermaid or merman is used generally for any human-like sea creature in these following stories, but the selkie is not. So first up is The Fisherman and the Merman by W.W. Gibbings. We are in Papa Stour and Hamnavoe, 2 islands that are heavily featured in Episode 2's People of the Sea by David Thompson. And speaking of that book, The Fisherman and the Merman story is almost the exact story that I described while recounting the stories in People of the Sea in the last episode, where a fisherman clubs and skins seals, but a surprise storm strands him on a skerry where he sees the skinned seals become people who lament their inability to return to the sea. So a mother of one of the seals strikes a bargain with him to take him ashore if he returns her son's skin. He cuts hand and footholds in her skin to accomplish this. Also by W.W. Gibbings is the story called The Mermaid Wife, and this is set in Unst. It's another typical fisherman, seal skin, has family, and then their kid finds the skin, and then she returns to the sea and her seal family. But this one mentions, and I see a pattern arising here, the woman talking in a foreign tongue to a large male seal from the shore, and at the end, when she calls back well wishes to the grieving husband on the shore, she admits she loved him but says, quote, she always loved her first husband much better. Fair enough. Lastly in this collection by W. Grant Stewart is The Seal Catcher's Adventure. Very similar to the Wounded Seal story in the other book that I talked about in episode 2 called Tales of the Seal Folk, and you'll also hear more similar stories in this episode as well, where a seal hunter is tricked by a stranger's assurance of a lucrative skin sale into being taken to an undersea lair where he becomes a seal himself and is asked to close the wound of the stranger's father, whom the hunter had stabbed earlier that day. The hunter is allowed to return home with a promise to stop harming seals. Being breathed on by the stranger turns him back into a human. The story also mentions Roan, which is a word for half dog, half fish creatures. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned the Fabric of Folklore podcast that I was featured on. And on the episode before me on that podcast, it just so happened that there was an author of a fairy tale collection that was talking about her book, which is called The Hidden Folk, Stories of Fairies, Dwarves, Selkies, and Other Secret Beings. So obviously this was meant to be not only because she talked about Selkies right before I was on, but also I had never heard of her book before. And like I was saying earlier as well, this is exactly how I prefer to come upon new Selkie material, is these serendipitous aligning of the stars. The author is Lise Lung Larsen. The book was published in 2004, and the story is called The Selkie Wife. And again, it's the standard fisherman steals the skin, marries and has kids with the reluctant but caring Selkie woman who longs for the sea and visits the shore to converse with a large male seal. See that pattern again? Until one of their kids finds a key to the chest with the skin in it, and the mother reveals the truth to her kids before returning to the sea. Now, this is a straight-up children's book, so it has a somewhat more happy ending than usual because, and we do see this in other iterations of the stories too, she returns to the shore in human form every Midsummer's Night Eve with her Selkie brethren to dance and play with her land kids, but not the dad. There is an author's note at the beginning of the story, which mentions the webbed fingers and toes idea. It provides details about the Selkie underwater kingdom, with beautiful houses decorated with ocean treasures and fences made of electric eels. It also mentions that they live in human form at the bottom of the sea, but need to put on skin to come to the surface. So we've been hearing a lot about this underwater kingdom, but it's literally under the water. It's not in water. And we'll be hearing more about that real soon. Published in 2008 by Donald Mackenzie, the next one is Scottish Wonder Tales from Myth and Legend. The story is called In the Kingdom of the Seals. And this one's going to be really familiar because after stabbing a seal while out fishing, a fisherman is requested to follow a stranger to his master's house for a job. But he gets pulled off a cliff and taken deep down in the ocean to the Selkie kingdom, where throngs of seal folk mill about. Houses are foam white, and the yards are sea moss, surrounded by sea forests. Our fisherman can breathe because he was turned into a seal along with the stranger. He's taken to a house where the stranger's father is dying from a stab wound, and only the fisherman can heal it. When he does, he's humbled and he vows to never hurt another seal again. For this vow, for the rest of his days, he's rewarded with full nets of fish. The seal folk in here are referred to as sea fairies, and that they live in cave houses near, quote, land under waves, which is their own kingdom. It mentions a comparison to green land fairies with how much they love music and dance. Irish Folk in Fairy Tales was edited and published by Gordon Jarvie in 2009. And in this collection, the story Eonin by Mary Patton tells of a fisherman on Arran, which they refer to as the Big Island, a little out of Kilronan facing the Galway coast. And our fisherman goes missing at sea during a storm, and his only son, who allegedly heard a mermaid singing from the shore, takes it upon himself to investigate, only gets swept out to sea and meets a talking conger eel, who respects his father and agrees to show the boy where the mermaids are to see if they can help. The Queen Mermaid takes the boy to see his father in their underwater cave kingdom and offers for him to take his father's place, which the boy agrees to. The mermaid removes his memories and he lives happily with them for a while until the conger eel comes to visit him and jogs his memory. While the mermaids are out one day, they go to Skerdmore Island to consult the Great Grey Seal, who is a cousin of the mermaids, to help get the boy out of his deal with them. The conger flatters the seal about his music, who thusly reveals that the boy will simply have to provide the mermaids with whatever they want most in the world. Easy, right? Which turns out to be a song that they don't already know. So the boy sings them one that his mother sang to his baby sister, and they reveal that they needed a new song for their baby mermaid all along. This relinquishes the boy of his deal with them, and he's able to return to his family as if seemingly no time has passed. The other story in this collection is called The Lady of Galaris, and this one is by the author that we first heard from, Thomas Crofton Croker. We are in Smurwick Harbor, where a man steals a beautiful Murrow's enchanted cap to take away her ability to return to the ocean. He discovers she's a princess and takes her to Ballinrunnig to marry her. They start a family and all's well until she discovers her cap hidden in the house, and though at first torn to leave her family, she puts on the cap, which takes away her earthly memories, and so she returns to the sea. Again, this is a Murrow story, and as we heard earlier, Thomas Croker describes Murrows very, very different than Selkies, but the thrust of the story is exactly the same as a traditional Selkie story, so that crossover is enough for me to include it. And speaking of more organic ways of me collecting this stuff, I mentioned earlier that people that know that I'm into this stuff will recommend or gift me things that they find to go along with my collection. So if you listen to episode 1, where I talked to my friend Chris, who was the one that introduced me to Selkie lore and inspired this whole deal, a few years ago, he found a short story in an anthology book called The Ammonite, Violin, and Others by Caitlin Kiernan, which was published in 2010. And there's a Selkie story in here called For One Who Has Lost Herself. The story starts in Viantro Bay in Chapinsay Island in the Orkney Islands, where a Selkie woman, who is described as tall, pale, slender, with large black eyes and a gray fur coat, is entranced by a man playing piccolo who steals her skin. 10 years later, in New York City, where it's implied that this is more modern day, because of more colloquial swearing and there's a PETA reference, our main character has traveled around the world following leads on finding her selkie skin, but to yet no avail. However, her journey has led her to an oddity shop in the city where she does find her skin, which is now owned by the cousin of the now dead thief that stole it 10 years ago. She almost doesn't get it because she has no money, but she remembers she has a golden coin from her past life, as it were, to pay for it. So, not part of a anthology collection, and again, not specifically a Selkie tale, but definitely has enough crossover. This was a short story I heard described in the podcast Lore by Aaron Mahnke, which, if you have not heard Lore and you're listening to this, definitely go listen to Lore and all of Aaron Mahnke's empire of other podcasts and material that he does about folklore and mythology, history, true crime. The guy covers it all. He's quite prolific. But I got to say, my wife discovering the Lore podcast and seeing what he accomplished with that is really what inspired me to actually take all of my Selkie stuff and put it into podcast form. So Lore will always have a very special place in my heart. And even more so when my wife told me to listen to this particular episode. In Lore Legends 7, published on August 7th, 2023, in an episode called Demon Lovers, there's a recounting of a short story called Sedna Sedna, which is an Inuit fairy tale about a woman duped by a bird spirit who was pretending to be human, to be her lover, but then betrayed by her father upon rescue from the bird spirit. He cuts off her appendages to get her off of his kayak in fear of the bird spirit coming for him too, and her body parts become the first sea animals like seals, whales, etc. So I think that's interesting. Number one, that it's a completely different area and culture of folklore, but we have this idea of a human transforming into a sea creature, in this case creating sea creatures, but that reciprocal connection is there. Also, it reminds me of a story from episode 2 of this podcast where they say that the seals were fallen angels. So a couple examples of like the beginnings of people explaining where something comes from in their lore. In this case in particular, seals. Thought that was interesting. Back to book collections, though. This story is called The Seal Catcher and the Selkie by Christopher Pinyard from the collection Celtic Mythology for Kids, published in 2020. It just says that it's in North Scotland, and stop me if you've heard this one before, but this is about a seal catcher who trades in fur, is warned by locals not to hunt the roan, otherwise known as the colossal seal in the area, because he's really a fairy. But the seal catcher doesn't believe in superstition. So out hunting one day, he stabs a seal, but it escapes before he can catch it. He's soon approached by a mysterious man on horseback in need of his fur trading services. So he goes with this man to the edge of a cliff, where the man sheds his skin and pulls him over the side into the sea. That's when the seal catcher realizes the man is truly a selkie. When he notices that the water isn't cold and he can breathe underwater. He's a quick one, isn't he? They come upon a, quote, magnificent underwater hall with walls of striking green color, crafted by sand, and mother of pearl. In the hall, the seal catcher finds that both he and his companion have turned into seals. Like I said, he's a quick one. He also knows a very somber tone in the halls about him where all the selkies are milling about. And soon, the man that brought him here presents him with his own knife, where our seal catcher is immediately terrified that they're going to want vengeance on him, but they all collectively assure him that they mean him no harm. They just want him to heal their king, the man's father, who is currently resting on a bed of seaweed. It's said that the only one that can heal him is the one that wounded him. So in this case, the seal catcher uses his flippers to graze the wound and magically heal it. He is allowed to return home as long as he vows to never harm another seal. To compensate him, the seal prince gives him a bag of gold that gets him and his family through the rest of his days without having to work. This next one is a bit of an outlier, like the lore podcast one was. This is a short story that was posted on a Facebook page called Scotland Stories in 2023. I have no idea who wrote it or when it was actually written, or if it was just a sort of non-official, non-published, but just somebody's version of the story. But again, this was one of those instances where somebody that knows about my obsession with selkies shared this with me. So of course I had to include it here. And for this one, it's so short, I'm just going to read it verbatim. And of course, it'll be linked just like all of the other books in here in the show notes. And this doesn't even have a title. It just begins that most relationships between selkies and humans ended in tragedy. Once these shape-shifting seal people remove their skin and transform into humans, they could be held against their will and forced into a loveless marriage. Fortunately, a man called MacCrimmon from Lewis had a happier story to tell. He had stumbled upon a group of selkies dancing on the beach one night and was astounded by the beauty of one. As each figure donned their sealskin again and slipped beneath the waves, MacCrimmon was too stunned to move. The selkie he had been watching caught sight of the islander and against her instinct approached. The pair struck up a conversation, and by some miracle, MacCrimmon convinced her to not return to the sea that night. Soon, they were madly in love, married, and had settled down in Barvas. The selkie woman still felt a strong affinity to the water, though, and the longer she stayed away, the weaker she became. Her husband knew how much being amongst her own kind in her natural habitat meant to her. When her earthly legs became too frail, MacCrimmon would carry his wife down to the beach. There she became a seal once more and rejuvenated herself in the Atlantic Ocean. One morning, MacCrimmon was still up to his waist in water, watching his selkie wife disappear, when an unfamiliar shape swam towards him. Suddenly, an enormous male seal burst to the surface and attacked, dragging him beneath the waves. He tried to reach his dirk as the seal sank its teeth into him, but in his panic the knife was lost amongst the sand. MacCrimmon was sure that this was the end for him, when suddenly the pressure released. As he blinked salt water from his eyes, he saw the hilt of his dirk protruding from the seal's chest, and the beach soaked in blood. MacCrimmon's wife had returned to rescue him, slipping off her sealskin in time to grab the knife. She hadn't been completely honest when they first met, and was already been promised to another selkie. Every time she returned to her people, she explained how happy she was with MacCrimmon, but it made no difference to her enraged betrothed. And it ends with a question. I wonder if the selkies tell each other a similar story, but from the other viewpoint. And lastly for this episode, another one of those serendipitous recommendations, I think it's a great place to end, is a collection of short stories by independent author Kyla Stan, published in 2023. And she actually had me do a pre-release review of her book, having found me through this podcast. And this book is interesting too because it's not just short stories, there's also poetry, and it includes tales about mermaids, sirens, selkies. And though I highly recommend the book, you can find it on Amazon. Remember, everything that I've mentioned today is linked in the show notes, which you can find at breathingunderwater.us. The two selkie specific stories in here are first a story called The Family Cloak, where a scientist mother brings her young daughter on seal conservation trips around the world. When at one point they're visiting the mother's uncle on the Scottish coast, her daughter befriends a local selkie boy and also bonds with the uncle. And when she returns a visit later as a teen, she falls in love with the selkie boy. She then returns as an adult to care for her deceased uncle's croft, and upon discovering she has Selkie ancestry, her Selkie boyfriend tries living with her on land at the house until he can't stand the separation from the sea anymore. So the girl becomes an artist that advocates for seal conservation and continues to share her bond with the Selkie boy from the shore, even though he doesn't ever return to the land. In another story called The Tempest in the Storm, it's not really specifically about Selkies, but they are mentioned by a fisherman father as a bedtime story to his daughter that's really more about a giant fish that creates trouble for a fishing village. So for now, that is what I have for my short story collection around Selkie and Selkie related and adjacent lore and creatures. A lot of interesting crossover and patterns, repetition, but also differences. In recording this episode, going through the stories by their date of publishing, it is really interesting, to me at least, to see the evolution, but also the carryover from where these stories begin and where they end up as time goes on. What we're going to be getting into more thoroughly as this podcast progresses was hinted at in some of the stories in here, like the one set in more modern day where a woman is looking for her seal coat, or the one we just talked about set in more modern day where a woman falls in love with a Selkie boy. As much as I love and adore and am undeniably obsessed with this lore in general, what really drew me to it and what continues to compel me about it is how it inspires new ideas and evolutions, taking the core elements and creating something new and unique out of it while still paying homage and tribute to what came before. That's exactly what I have intentions of too. So stay tuned for all of that and much, much more here on Selkiecast. And again, I'm Dan. I appreciate you so much for listening. Please find me at breathingunderwater.us, where there's a bunch of different ways to get in touch. Looking forward to hearing from you. See you soon.